The Second World War. For 6 years, Britain faced the fight of its life. This was a total war, and it reached every corner of Britain and British life. I'm Arthur Williams, a pilot and former Royal Marine who is fascinated by the Second World War. In this series, I'm going to travel the length and breadth of Britain to discover the places and people who helped us win the war. I'll walk the paths and byways to get a different perspective and make some fascinating discoveries. I'll uncover some of Britain's finest moments, as well as some that we'd sooner forget. This time, I'm in South Devon. This corner of the country may be famous for its sandy beaches and beautiful coves, but during World War II it became home for the biggest relocation of people in British history.
You've got hundreds of children. The resources simply are not enough to cope with the influx of children.
Refugees fleeing the continent. It's amazing to think that during the height of the war, there was a little piece of free Belgium here in Devon. And a military launch pad for thousands of American soldiers, known as GIs.
There were 92 road traffic incidents, and the Americans were involved in most of those.
Devon and its coastline led the way as the Allies geared up for the largest seaborne invasion in history, D-Day. All of these people made a lasting impression on Devon, but what's more is they made a vital impact on the final outcome of the war. My journey in South Devon begins with a train ride into Paignton, one of the region's wartime hubs for evacuees. I'll travel to Brixham to discover how the fishing port became an outpost of Belgium. I'll visit Street, where villagers were told to leave their homes for unexplained reasons. And I'll head to Salcombe, the departure point for thousands of American GIs sailing to Normandy, many never to return. In 1938, secret meetings were held in London to prepare for the worst. War was on the horizon, and the authorities feared that the nation's cities would be blown to smithereens. So they came up with an audacious plan to save lives. The plan? They would evacuate the most vulnerable members of society from the cities to safe areas. It was the biggest mass migration of people in Britain's history. On the 1st of September 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, the plan was put into action. 1.5 million were evacuated in just 3 days. Thousands of evacuated children flooded into South Devon. And I'm starting my journey by taking the same mode of transport that the evacuees would have taken. For me today, travelling on this train is a wonderfully romantic experience. It's like it hasn't changed much since the 1940s. But I'd imagine for the children that were travelling on here as evacuees, this must have been a very, very scary and confusing time. They're being sent away from their families, and let's not forget, some of them would have been incredibly young. They wouldn't have had any family members with them. They were going into the countryside not knowing where or for how long, and I'd imagine for many of them not really understanding why. It would have been just as traumatic for the parents too. They only want to safeguard their children, particularly at a time of war, and they know that the best way to do that is to send them away from the cities that are likely to get bombed by the Germans. But at the same time, you can't physically protect your child. It must have been very sad. The only slight payoff to all of the confusion and fear from the children's point of view would be the fact that you can't deny this does feel like a bit of an adventure.
By 1940, over 37,000 children had been sent to Devon. More kids from London were sent here than any other English county. Children arrived with labels attached to them like parcels. Although parents were given a list of essentials all children should bring with them, many had little more than a toothbrush.
To say for the children arriving here it was a culture shock is an understatement. Some of them came from wealthy families, but the vast majority came from very poor inner city areas. A lot of them had never seen the countryside before, and it's said that some were terrified of cattle, and some had never even eaten vegetables.
But it wasn't just a shock for the children. The locals needed to get used to the new arrivals too. From Paignton, I'm walking 3 miles around Torbay to Torquay, a town that took in so many evacuees that they outnumbered local kids by 7 to 1. That made even the most everyday things difficult. Torquay Girls' Grammar School was one of the local schools that had to adapt, and fast.
Harry, how did the school adapt to this influx of new children that it had under its care?
Well, it's an enormous strain. I mean, literally, you've got hundreds of children that are going to be present at the grammar school during the course of the war. The teachers do as the teachers always do. They do their absolute professional best for each and every child with the resources that they've got. But in the circumstances of war, the resources simply are not enough to cope with the influx of children. Kids end up sharing, and you can imagine what that's like for children who suddenly find their new classmates in the class and they're having to share a desk. This is a real problem for them. So things like desks and resources have got to be brought down from London to accommodate these kids. It's a real squeeze for teachers and for the kids.
What did the evacuees get up to outside of school?
Well, you've got a child's school diary. It's a school diary for girls. This particular individual, who was a little girl called Betty. Now, it's not the most full diary, and she certainly didn't write everything down. But if we flick through it, we see she's recording some interesting things here. We've got primroses and violets.
Yeah.
When are we talking? We're talking March, April. She's picking primroses and violets.
And not something she'd have been able to do in London?
Well, no. Kids really begin to use that change of environment to begin to think about different things. She goes down to Goodrington Sands here with her friend Rosemary. Tear my dress. This is obviously a very bad day, and indeed she's underlined it in red. And, you know, arrivals, stuff arriving from home, so, you know, a parcel. And then later on, she's got a list of the films that she's gone out to see. And my personal favourite, Pinocchio. Very good. Tick. She obviously liked Walt Disney and Pinocchio an awful lot. So it gives you a little insight into the kinds of life that she's experiencing here. A little reminder of the life of a little girl from the 1940s. Really rather wonderful.
What was the process like of finding families to take the evacuees in? Did they have to volunteer?
It's basically a process of assignment. You've got billeting officers who are assessing, you know, who's got the spaces, who's got the gaps. Once the information's been established, you're under an obligation to take the children that the local authority is asking you to take. And that's quite a lot of social pressure. You know, in the middle of war, you want to be seen to be doing your bit, and you might not like having these children foisted upon you. You might think my days of being a carer are long over, but I'm sorry, the state in the middle of war requires you.
How did the evacuees integrate with the other school kids?
Well, all told, you ended up with something like about 400 different evacuee children here from about 150 different schools. And what that meant in practical terms is going up and down these corridors, you would have seen about 120 different school uniforms. But kids will always make friends. Kids will learn to get along. They make the best of their environment. Even though it's very, very strange, even though it's a great challenge, they rise to the occasion. And by and large, it seems as though it's a remarkably successful process. The kids make friends. Many of them really learn to like the families that they're billeted with. But of course, children here have been evacuated from the middle of London, and suddenly they're finding themselves beside the sea in sunny Torquay on the English Riviera. So, you can imagine the kind of homesickness. They're aware of what's going on in London and the South East. They're sort of on the newspapers is things like, St Paul's wreathed in smoke, and accounts of air raids and numbers of people are being killed. So, there's a constant sort of thinking, well, what's happening at home? What about friends? What about members of family? So, as it were, it must have felt very, very strange.
When the war ended, many of the children were faced with returning home to cities and even parents that they barely remembered. And whilst most returned voluntarily, there were others that were forced back in order to help rebuild family businesses. Some even stayed in the local area and forged new lives for themselves.
I'm in Devon, which has been described as the most invaded county in Britain, at least as far as the Second World War is concerned. I'm travelling from Torquay, which welcomed hundreds of London's evacuated children, and walking 8 miles around Torbay to Brixham to hear about a different kind of evacuee. Historically, this part of the country has always had a close connection with Europe. When the continent was overrun, many refugees fled Nazi rule.
During the war, 2,000 Belgian refugees made Brixham their home, and the locals and the refugees actually shared quite a lot in common, both having strong fishing traditions.
You'd think they would have gotten on well together, but that wasn't always the case. When they first arrived, the refugees were confined to the quayside. Eventually, they were allowed out.
It's amazing to think that during the height of the war, there was a little piece of free Belgium here in Devon. It's just a shame there isn't more evidence around to suggest that they were ever here at all. You wouldn't know if you were passing through.
Eventually, the locals did all they could to help the refugees integrate, including issuing all public notices in English and Flemish. A local Belgian fishery school was even opened on the quay, and it's said that when the refugees' children were asked which part of Belgium they came from, they would answer Brixham. When the war ended, most of the refugees returned to Belgium. But they harboured fond memories of their time here. Many returned frequently to see friends and relive their experiences. From Brixham, I'm walking 5 miles cross-country to Kingswear, and then taking a 10-minute ferry to Dartmouth on the western bank of the Dart estuary. In the interwar years, South Devon was promoted as a glamorous holiday destination. And when the locals weren't entertaining tourists, they were busy landing crab and building boats in the port of Dartmouth.
But it wasn't the port that made Dartmouth famous. You see that big grand building up there? Well, that's the Britannia Royal Naval College, where Allied officers from around the world were trained. Kind of got a bit of a Downton Abbey feel about the place, isn't it?
When it became clear war was coming, the college went into overdrive.
This is a real privilege for me. Not very many people get to look inside the Royal Naval College. but I do today.
I've been allowed special access inside to see how the war changed things.
What would the college have been like during the war years, Jane?
During the war, the college was still basically a school, a private school run by the Navy for the Navy. So the cadets, the majority, would have joined at the age of 13. They would have been getting on with their usual schoolwork. They would have had all their regular school subjects, their maths, their English, their history, their geography, in addition to the more specialised subjects, the seamanship, navigation. But inevitably, with the war going on, they'd have air raid sort of training so that they would jump under the desks. Some of the boys had responsibility for ensuring all the blackouts were abided by. And one or two of the more senior cadets would even be given duties manning some of the anti-aircraft guns in and around Dartmouth. They certainly had their responsibilities.
Did the population here swell during the war years?
Absolutely. The number of cadets increased. They need to keep the training pipeline going so that they've got more new officers coming through, because obviously nobody knew how long the war would last. A number of allies sent cadets here, everybody from the Free French to Norwegians to Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand. So it was quite a multinational student population within a few years of war breaking out.
One of the most famous students at the college during the war was Prince Philip, and a chance encounter here was to change his life.
It was during his time here that the royal family visited in July 1939. He was given the job of looking after the two princesses while their parents were off doing their official duties. He made a significant impression on the young Princess Elizabeth. They spent most of the 2 days together playing croquet, playing with the captain's children's train sets when they were indoors. As far as he was concerned, I think his abiding impression, or the standout moment for him, was actually his invitation to dine on board the royal yacht, which had brought the royal family into Dartmouth, rather than its future significance for the rest of his life. But certainly from Elizabeth's point of view, this was the moment. She certainly remembers meeting Philip for the first time.
With such a vital role in the Allied war effort, the college was a natural target for the Luftwaffe's bombers. But in the 1930s, German cadets had made frequent exchange visits, and it's believed Hitler held the college in such high esteem that he ordered it to be spared for future Nazi use. But by 1942, Hitler had been forced to abandon his invasion plans, and Dartmouth College became a legitimate target.
Did they ever put on any bombing raids or attacks?
They did. 2 bombs fell on the college. It was September 1942. One fell not far from where we are now, just above us, brought down most, if not all, of the roof. And the other bomb, again, not far from where we are now, the other corner, what is actually a stairwell, was blown out. So some pretty significant structural damage. Very luckily, the timing of the attack fell at the end of leave. And what we think is that the Germans, based on their previous visits in the 1930s, calculated that on this particular day, the 18th of September 1942, just after 11 o'clock in the morning, according to the schedules that they'd seen, that would be when the captain would have been standing here where we are on the quarterdeck. Whereas actually it was the end of the last week of leave because there was an extra week of summer's leave on this particular year. Had it been the first week of term, had you been stood down here, particularly if you'd only been 13 or 14 years old, you wouldn't have had much of a chance.
Is there any evidence of the bombing raids still to be seen today?
There is. When they rebuilt the corridor, some of the bricks were no longer available. The walls are glazed bricks, which look like green tiles. So there are some bricks which clearly are not bricks because they're much duller than the tiled bricks, and they're just blocks of wood which have been painted to blend in with the tiles. The sort of official damage, if you like, is the statue of King George V at the back of the quarterdeck. There's a corner missing. That was caused by falling debris, and that's been deliberately left as a reminder of what happened.
From Dartmouth, it's a 5-mile walk across the South Hams Hills to the medieval village of Street. You'd think the war largely passed such places by, but you'd be wrong. There was about to be an invasion. In November 1943, posters went up in all of the local villages announcing that the area was being requisitioned for military purposes. All residents had to be out by the 20th of December. That was in 6 weeks' time, and of course only 5 days before Christmas. The government requisitioned 20,000 acres of the South Devon coast. The zone was far from unpopulated and contained 180 farms, 28 shops, 11 pubs and over 500 homes. Residents were told simply that everything had to go. The Americans were going to be using the area for battle training, and at public meetings they were reassured that the GIs wouldn't do any more damage than was necessary. But if you're a homeowner, that's not very reassuring. The announcement shocked the locals. It's still remembered to this day. Pam Willis was just 11 years old when her family were evacuated from this house.
Can you remember what it was like when you were told you had to evacuate?
Well, exciting for kids,
Really?
but not for parents.
Yeah.
Parents only had 6 weeks to get prepared and find somewhere to live and somewhere to go.
Where did they go?
Well, we went to a little village called, or a hamlet called Beeson, just outside the evacuation area near Beesons.
Did you get sort of any compensation from the government, like for rehousings? And there wasn't any sort of compulsory purchase order in place. It was just, sorry.
Well, it was compulsory purchase. They kicked us out.
It's so hard to imagine.
But in the end, if it was really desperate, they'd have put you in somewhere until you found somewhere.
Yeah.
But you had to find somewhere yourself.
Gosh. What was the spirit in the villages like? Were people generally in uproar?
Well, I didn't know that they were actually in an uproar, but they, obviously upset.
Was it? I suppose it would have been much harder for the farmers.
The farmers in the village, they either had to find somewhere to go with all their stock, or otherwise they sold it.
Yeah.
A lot of farmers lost a lot of money because so many animals going to the market, the prices were down.
Yeah.
The animals didn't make the money they should have done.
Did they ever tell you, look, we need this area because we're training for an amphibious landing?
Well, they did. Well, they did say that they wanted the area for the Americans for training, but that was all. I mean, didn't know what it was for. Yeah. Well, apparently the beaches here were similar to the beaches that they landed on.
Yeah.
That's why they chose this area. I was talking to one man that came back here for a holiday. He was in his 80s. He said that he'd just finished high school at 19-year-old, and he hadn't a clue where he was going, and some of his training he did here. He said, we're so thankful that you allowed us to come in and practice here, because he said, if we hadn't have had the experience of landing on the beaches here, he said there would have been a lot more of our boys killed when we went for the second front.
What was it like when you came back? Was your house all right? Was it intact? Were you worried about what it might be like?
Well, we were lucky.
Yeah.
There was 1 or 2 cracked panes of glass, but no other damage to the house. The ordinary private houses, they sent a firm in to repair up any small damages.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, people had left stuff in their houses, and when they came back, it had gone.
Oh, really? Yeah. Did you ever have a sense that this is just what we have to do our bit for the war effort?
I think that's what everybody thought.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, they were true Devonians. They were so laid back, they just did it, you know. I mean, that's Devonians all over, isn't it?
Yeah.
No.
You know, when I think about the sacrifices made by Pam and her fellow villagers, it's just so hard to try and understand what they must have gone through, being turfed out of your home. But for these American young men, not only were they exploring abandoned villages, but they were halfway around the world knowing that they were about to go to war. And when you look at the beach behind us there, this was all necessary. This all needed to happen. The sacrifices that both parties made were what was required for what was about to take place over in France.
I'm travelling through South Devon, learning as I go about the refugees who came here from London and the local villagers who were themselves displaced for live firing exercises. From the evacuated village of Street, I'm now walking 2.5 miles through the evacuation zone down towards the coast and the beach of Slapton.
Look at that.
In 1941, this whole area was requisitioned for training, including military bombardment.
So there's very, very little evidence that the military ever had a presence here. But this is a former 1920s hotel that was flattened by gunfire.
Although this all happened over 75 years ago, the area still bears the scars of the American training exercises.
Amazing. You know, this is really the only remnants that there is of the government requisition of this site and the military use for it. That would have once been a really, really grand building. But now to look at, I mean, it looks like a medieval castle, it's that overgrown. It's impossible to tell that this is a hotel unless you were told. See if we can get around the back here. Many of the people that were turned out of this area were fortunate enough to be able to come back to their homes and, I guess, continue more or less as they were before. But you imagine being the owner of this place, the unlucky one. You come back here and you're a successful hotelier, you've got a magnificent property, and it's flattened. It's incredible.
"15,000 American GIs conducted exercises in South Hams. But it wasn't just the buildings up here that they were interested in. Devon has many lovely beaches, but none with the story of Slapton Sands. It kept a great secret for many years, but it's now clear that the key to America's presence here in South Devon was this very stretch of shoreline.
The Americans' training left a load of mines all over this beach. So many, in fact, that in the 1950s they thought they'd have to close it completely. But that's not the only thing the Americans left behind.
In the 1970s, fishermen told local resident Ken Small that their nets kept getting caught on something strange. I'm meeting Dean, Ken's son, to find out more.
Dean, what was snagging on the fishermen's nets?
Well, that was the interesting thing. I think that nothing made sense. My dad knew that there was no rocks or anything in the area, so I think that's what fascinated him. But interestingly, the fishermen, they didn't seem quite so bothered about it because they just knew there was something there, so they avoided it. My dad thought, well, you want to know what it is. And eventually, after a bit of persuasion, he persuaded the guy who told him about it to dive down and have a look. The fisherman dived down and then came back up to tell my dad what he had found on the seabed. Hanging over the side of the boat, he said, "It's a tank." And my dad said, "What, oil tank or water tank?" And he said, "No."
And what was that?
Well, it turned out to be a World War II amphibian or a Sherman tank.
It was a Sherman DD tank, an amphibious vehicle that could not only float on the water, but could also navigate the sea using twin propellers. The surprise discovery sparked worldwide interest, and eventually it was revealed that the tank had been part of a gigantic top-secret D-Day landing exercise on the Devonshire coast, Operation Tiger.
Why were the Americans conducting exercises here on the south coast?
Well, this particular area was chosen because of its familiarity with Utah Beach. So the exercises on Slapton Sands were to replicate Utah because they were geographically very similar. Of course, the practices were live fire, the idea being to give the young American soldiers a real idea of what battle would be like. Now, this tank came off one of the LSTs, and due to an error during routine servicing, it immediately sank.
Gosh. So what happened on the exercise?
It was in the early hours of the 28th of April. A group of LSTs, that huge American vessel that would take masses of equipment, machinery and men. So it's a huge vehicle, very slow moving. And 8 of them were going to form in convoy in Lime Bay. The idea was to do a figure of 8 movement. This would simulate the amount of time that it would take to cross the channel. Unfortunately, while they were doing this maneuver, they were discovered by German E-boats, or Schnellboats as they're known, fast torpedo boats, because they heard radio chatter and they couldn't understand it. It was unusual. And they came out of Cherbourg, 4 of them broke off the convoy, and they discovered the LSTs in Lime Bay, and then subsequently attacked them. The first LST blew up horrendously. These were fully laden ships, fully armed. There were trucks on board, tanks on board, and when that initially happened, the fuel set fire, so the sea was ablaze. 3 were hit. 1 was very badly damaged and managed to limp back to Dartmouth. The other 2 sank within minutes, LST 507 and the 531.
How many people lost their lives?
In total, 639 American servicemen lost their lives during that attack. Many of them drowned from being blown off the vessels. Many of them weren't instructed correctly as to how to wear their life jackets, and because they were fully kitted out, so when they went into the water they actually toppled forward and many of them drowned.
The tragic story of Operation Tiger made Dean's father determined to recover the Sherman tank from the seabed and build a lasting memorial to the brave young soldiers who had so tragically lost their lives.
Well, it took many years, to be honest, but eventually my dad managed to buy it from the American government, and then some years later he started the recovery process, which was long and expensive.
How did they physically go about actually removing it from the sea? It's not an easy thing to do.
It took several days to actually recover the tank. Initially what they did, they got some commercial divers, went down to put huge straps underneath the tank and inflate giant airbags to give a degree of buoyancy. Because of course the tank would weigh around 34 tons, but it also had a lot of silt inside it, which increased its weight. So by giving it a little bit of buoyancy, the idea then was to very slowly tow the tank into the shore. And from then, it would be a question of winching. It took almost a couple of days to get it from the shoreline up to the concrete slipway. And as they pulled it on the concrete, all the barnacles and crustaceans all started to free up and move. And amazingly, it just went on its own tracks.
And presumably where it is now isn't so far from where it was actually found.
Yeah, and now it sits here as a reminder and a memorial to those who lost their lives.
I'm in Devon, which played a crucial role in the preparations for D-Day. For months, beaches across the county and the entire nation had been used to practice for the big day. Ships and tanks had been amassed and detailed plans conveyed to thousands of troops. Now, it was time to do it for real.
As D-Day approached, towns found they were swamped with troops, all getting ready for the most audacious moment of the war.
From Slapton Sands, I've walked 9 miles southwest to the popular resort of Salcombe. Here, almost 2,000 GIs descended on the town, outnumbering the locals. They quickly transformed the town.
These beautifully quaint little streets haven't changed for centuries, I'd imagine, till the Americans came along and the bulldozers moved in with them. That's because for this little spot here, they needed access to the water for all of their heavy hardware. And unfortunately, for the residents that used to live in this now car park, the bulldozers flattened it to make access to the waterway for all of their military hardware. Now, it might sound really harsh, but that's what was necessary to help win the war.
The quayside became the centre of American activity in the town. Cranes worked around the clock, repairing landing craft and preparing supplies. To accommodate the GIs, the military took over Salcombe's large hotels like Cliff House, which overlooks the estuary.
Roger, what sort of impact did the Americans have here in Salcombe?
Oh, they had a huge impact. Over 2,000 American servicemen descended on the town between September 1943 and January 1944 and outnumbered the local population. Over 60 properties were requisitioned, houses, hotels, garages, workshops, and at the top of the town they built 3 hutted camps for the men. And in the centre of the town they demolished 2 rows of old cottages to provide hard standing for the repair of the landing craft. And there was absolute mayhem on the roads. You can imagine all the heavy vehicles, low loaders, trying to negotiate the narrow lanes. Yeah. Whilst they were here, there were 92 road traffic incidents, and the Americans were involved in most of those, so pretty chaotic.
It's as if this sleepy coastal town in South Devon was just militarised almost overnight.
That's right, yeah.
My lord, and what was the locals' reaction?
Surprisingly, it was very positive. The natives were friendly and welcoming. They'd already endured 4 years of war. They'd been subject to bombing raids. There were 11 bombing raids, 17 civilian deaths, and they just wanted the war over. They were pretty war-weary by September 1943. So the Americans were just seen as a way of getting the job done.
Right.
Children were the most welcoming. They used to follow the GIs around and were rewarded with candy and chocolate. And the local girls weren't averse to a bit of flirting, and there were a number of GI brides to prove that...
In the 2 months leading up to D-Day, there were 2 groups stationed in Salcombe. The US Navy Construction Battalion, whose job it was to maintain the landing craft, and the 6th and 7th Beach Battalions, who would be going in on the first wave of D-Day landings.
Their time here was spent practicing landing on local beaches.
Right, I see.
It would be absolutely crammed with vessels, all sorts of landing craft, and they're very large landing ship tanks. They were over 4,000 tons.
Yeah.
They would have about 40 tanks, or up to 400 men on board when they finally sailed. And then there were the middle-sized ones, the LCTs, the LCIs, which were repaired over at Mill Bay there and prepared for D-Day. And then there were all the smaller landing craft, the Higgins boats, all ready to go. It would have been a very tense time in the build-up, and they would be working hard, playing hard, but yeah, they knew that they were going to be in there in the front line.
To keep the GIs out of trouble during that time off, the Red Cross organised dances, concerts and bingo sessions here at Cliff House. But many GIs couldn't resist the charms of an English pub, even if they did have to develop a taste for warm beer and rough cider. And Salcomb's publicans insisted that everyone was welcome, in defiance of a particular US military policy.
There were quite a few black troops, stewards and cooks, and they were strictly segregated from their white compatriots. But the locals wouldn't have anything to do with that. They couldn't understand that. So, for instance, the pub landlords refused to introduce sort of segregated bars, much to their credit.
Given the circumstances with which the Americans were here, I'd imagine tensions were quite high. Was it all plain sailing?
No, there were a few tensions, particularly in the early days. One of the things was that in preparing the landing craft for D-Day, the construction battalions worked day and night. So at night, the slipways at White Strand and over at Mill Bay were illuminated with floodlights, arc lights, so the whole sky was ablaze at night. And yet the locals were still subject to blackout regulations, with the wardens going around saying, put that light out, even if there was just a little chink of light.
I would imagine then almost as quickly as they'd arrived, they were all gone again, come the D-Day landings.
Yeah, a number of people said how uncanny it was that suddenly the town transformed itself from being absolutely crazy with activity, the harbour chock-a-block with landing craft ready to go, and then they would wake up and find that they'd all gone, and then the town was just so quiet and dead.
All of those boats that had just amassed out here, all the troops that were lining the streets, and then just gone.
Yeah, and it must have been a very strange atmosphere indeed.
Salcombe Harbour was fine for smaller landing craft, but it wasn't big enough to maintain the huge troop carriers. For these giants, the GIs built a slipway across the bay. Their ghostly remains can still be seen from the air today.
Finally, all the preparations were done. It was time to go.
On the morning of the 4th of June 1944, the residents of Salcombe woke to find their harbour crammed with more ships than ever before. The Americans were preparing to leave for Normandy. In classic British fashion, the weather was terrible. So bad, in fact, that the entire invasion was delayed for 24 hours.
The young Americans would have been walking down these very streets, on this quay, down steps that would have been behind me, loading onto troop carriers and landing craft, and the next piece of solid ground they'd step foot on would be the beaches of Normandy. They'd be staring right down the barrel of a German machine gun. It was kill or be killed, and I can only imagine that for so many of them, it must have felt like they were on their way to the executioner's gallows.
Once out of the safety of Salcombe Harbour, the troops rendezvoused with other units based at ports along the South Devon coast. They united into Assault Force U and sailed to Normandy. The 21,000 GIs who left Salcombe landed at Utah Beach and took it back from the Nazis under heavy gunfire and shelling. All their preparation in South Devon paid off. The beach fell to the Allies.
So many people came to this beautifully rural county during the war. Americans, Canadians, Polish, Belgians, those that were evacuated from London. And Devon opened up its arms. It welcomed them here. It had to. It was a time of desperate need. But if they hadn't have done that, the larger events like D-Day, that we all know so much about, may have ended very differently.